As a church mouse, some of my earliest memories were of going to church with my mother almost every single week. And amid all the things that I learned from church in my childhood, I can remember as a teenager what I used to think when preachers would frequently say that they received their sermons from God. Now, being the curious child that I was, I would often wonder how my pastor was able to preach a different sermon almost every single week. As a child who struggled with doing a book report, I'd often wonder where all this preaching material was coming from. Now, needless to say, many of us might have the same thoughts in the back of our minds, even as adults, and we may have sufficient reasons to wonder. And that's why our subject for today's show is, where do sermons come from? We'll briefly discuss this question right now on the program for lay preachers, the Layman's Guidepost. Where do some people think sermons come from? There are many extremes manifested in the way people often view sermons. There are those who think that sermons are mere monologues on social politics, and there are those that think that they are direct dictations from God. There are those that think preaching is just telling other people their personal testimonies. The purpose of this episode of the Layman's Guidepost is to demonstrate that these approaches are not responsible ways to view preaching. 1. Sermons are not mere monologues on social politics. Preachers are not to use the worship service as a means to draw an audience to merely listen to their political and societal views as if it was a news and commentary show. Your pulpit ministry should not turn the worship service into the Thomas Hardy show. In the Gospel of John, chapter 7, verse number 18, Jesus teaches us, "He that speaks of himself seeks his own glory." Number 2, sermons are not prophecies sent from God to man, like when God gave the 10 Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 31, verse number 18, the Bible tells us that the 10 Commandments were written with the finger of God. Scripture teaches us that when Moses ascended into Mount Sinai, God dictated and wrote down word for word what the message was. On the other hand, sermons are practical discourses on what the prophets have already spoken of in the Bible, and not what God says to the pastor every week. 3. Sermons are not mere testimonies about what God has done for you. To be clear, the preacher should be preaching what has already been revealed to us in the Bible, not merely what has happened in their personal lives. When you share with a group of people what God has done for you, that's called testifying. Sermons are about the scriptures. Testimonies are about your personal experiences with God. Number 4, preaching is not a performance art. Preachers are not taking the stage like some kind of performer or comedian. They are not merely keeping everyone entertained for 20 or 30 minutes. It's not about eloquence or shock jocking, nor is it about drawing attention to oneself as a preacher. It's about getting a biblical message through to the audience. Sermons are not comedy sketches or testimonies. Sermons are not performance arts or authoritative prophecies. Sermons are just that, sermons. Now, for the last minute or two, I've been telling you what sermons are not. Perhaps it would be fitting for me to tell you what sermons are. Let me give you 2 definitions of a sermon. A sermon might be defined as a speech given in a public setting which takes biblical teachings about God and man, examines those concepts in their original context, explains them to the understanding of the audience, and objectively applies them to modern life in a relevant and responsible way. Now, a homespun definition of sermonizing might be something close to this. It's a public Bible-based speech clarifying authentically scriptural concepts for the benefit of others. Now that we've reviewed what a sermon is, I'll briefly review where they actually come from. Let me give you 6 ways that a preacher can be inspired to deliver a sermon on a given topic. Number 1, personal study and prayer. Preacher's study and prayer life often determines what he preaches. Sometimes he may deem it more efficient to carry the congregation along in his personal study of a passage of Scripture. This approach is an efficient way to get things done if you have a busy schedule. 2. Need. Seeing a need in the congregation for certain things to be discussed may require sermonic emphasis from the preacher. This makes it practical for the preacher to focus on certain themes that will help his respective congregation. 3. Divine impression. God may speak to the preacher through impressions and personal spiritual experiences or experiences with other people, circumstances, life lessons, and even supernatural occurrences, but not always in the same way. Remember, the preacher is not to preach the experience that inspired them about the topic. Rather, they're to preach the Bible-based message found in Scripture. Number 4. Obvious inspirational impact. An interesting or inspirational scriptural topic or concept discovered by the preacher may also stimulate a sermon on that topic. After all, if it's a blessing to you as the preacher, it will likely be a blessing to the congregation. Number 5, current events. Current events in the surrounding world or in the local church may often dictate the need for matters to immediately be addressed. While addressing current events, do not preach on the current event. Preach the Bible. Your sermon should not be about the events of the world, but about a word from heaven. Number 6, direct requests. Often there may be direct requests given, such as invitations to speak at a special program or at a study group. This would tend to limit the preacher to a certain theme, hence he should shape his comments accordingly. Now, once again, these are the 6 areas. 1, personal study and prayer. 2, need. 3, divine impression. 4, obvious inspirational impact. 5, current events. 6, direct requests. Now, this understanding of the origin and role of sermons should help calibrate our thoughts about sermons. 1, it should change the way we view sermons. We should stop viewing sermons as monologues and prophecies. They're just man's best attempt at explaining, arguing, and applying what the prophets have already spoken about. In essence, it is someone being inspired to speak on what has already been inspired authoritatively in Scripture. 2, it should change the way we listen to sermons. We should abandon the all or nothing mentality and learn to chew up the meat and spit out the bones when listening to other people preach. Just because God has used the preacher in the past doesn't mean that they're infallible in the present. A preacher is only as authoritative as they are biblical, and you as a listener are still responsible for what you choose to accept to be truth. 3, it should change the way we preach sermons. If you're a lay preacher, stop putting too much pressure on yourself to be perfect and make sure that your sermon is genuinely biblical. In short, prophecies are from prophets, sermons are from preachers. They are not the same thing. Because this is true, sermons do not have to come from supernatural experiences for them to be legitimate. All they need to be is biblical, productive, and beneficial to our daily lives. As preachers, we do not need to actually write the vision in order to make it plain, if you know what I mean. And that concludes our installment of the Layman's Guidepost today. Thank you for viewing this video entitled, Where Do Sermons Come From? And for the Layman's Guidepost, I'm Thomas Hardy. If you enjoyed this program and you'd like to see more, subscribe to this page. Also, please remember to like this video and be sure to share this video with others who could use this information. Finally, you can request a copy of my training workbook, The Layman's Guide to Biblical Preaching, a 7-step plan. Just click on the link below. This indispensable tool will take you step by step through the process of writing each one of your sermons in a clear and easy to understand way. Learn the secret to delivering powerful sermons and lessons today. And as always, for the Layman's Guidepost, I'm Thomas Hardy.